You're listening to the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, where we speak with founders, CEOs, investors, advisors, experts, and thought leaders in the brave new world of psychedelics and entheogenic medicines. Brought to you by Psychedelic Invest, bringing you unparalleled psychedelic investing data and analysis. Psychedelic Invest is the industry's leading resource for those looking to invest in the burgeoning psychedelic industry. For more information and to access all of the podcast episodes, check out our website at psychedelicinvest.com/podcast. And now, here's the host of the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Psychedelic Invest Podcast. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. And we have two guests today, Richard Meloff and Godfrey. They are co-founders of Nushama. We're going to talk to them about what they're doing in psychedelics and really their approach and their angle. I think that we're really sort of seeing, obviously, a lot of interest and, kind of explosion of opportunities and people involved in the space. But there's lots of different facets and lots of different kind of angles to this. And it's going to be a fascinating conversation on really what their take is, how they've approached this market, and where they see the future going. So with that, Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bruce.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Before we kind of get into what you're doing today and, kind of the focus and what the activities are and where you are in terms of the business, I'd love to get a background. How did you each kind of get into this? How did you come together? Give us the story. Give us the kind of the origin of the business and how you guys approached it. And I'll let you decide who wants to kind of kick us off on that.
Happy to kick it off. I was an investment banker for a year. I moved to the United States from Canada to work at Citibank or Citigroup. Uh-huh. And after about 14 months of what I consider to be torture, I decided that wasn't for me. And I did what every investment banker does, which is apply to design school. So I ended up going to the Parsons School of Design. I spent the last 15 years or so as a women's wear designer. And how does that relate to psychedelics? It doesn't, except for the fact that...
I was waiting for the connection.
It doesn't at all. But what's kind of interesting about my story, I think, is in about 2015, I had started going to talk therapy. Yeah. And what I found was I was going every single week. I was paying about $350 every single week, 3 years, so $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 out of pocket. And while it was great because I learned strategies and coping mechanisms, something underneath it all just didn't feel right. I felt, there's something was disconnected. And ultimately, my confidence wasn't there. I just didn't feel good enough, or I lacked worthiness. And a good friend of mine suggested plant medicine. And I was incredibly fortunate to meet a great couple that does shamanic work with plants. Yeah. And it's been life-changing for me. And during a journey that I took in May 2020, as COVID was kind of at its height, the fashion industry was at its low. Nobody was going out, and women weren't wearing dresses, especially ones of the cocktail variety. Yeah. It came to me in this journey, in this plant medicine experience, that while I was very excited about the hopeful legalization of MDMA in 2023 or 2024, and the psilocybin potential legalization beyond that, and the LSD or DMT and Ibogaine even beyond that, I was concerned that there were people suffering from all sorts of mood disorders, whether it be depression, addiction, PTSD, you name it, and there weren't solutions today, and antidepressants weren't working, and what can I do today because more people need this? That's what I was thinking during my journey. And my journey was on a Saturday night, and 2 days later, I'm walking along the street listening to a podcast, actually, Tim Ferriss with Rick Doblin, thinking to myself, well, we got to do this somehow. And my college friend and my brother's college roommate, Richard Meloff, gave me a ring and said, I know you're really interested in plant medicine and psychedelics. Have you ever thought about doing something commercially? Yeah. And I'll let Richard kind of tell where it went from there, because his background is different. But equally as interesting, I think.
So thread one. So thread two, Richard. What was your journey? What was your side of the story?
So I also lived in New York. After law school, I was a Wall Street lawyer for 3 years. I'm a little slower on the uptake than Jay, so it took me 3 years to figure out that wasn't for me. And I returned to Canada and was involved in a number of entrepreneurial ventures. But the last 2 years, I was a senior executive in the legal cannabis space in Canada. Yep. And what I saw, not necessarily with my company, which was predominantly recreational use, but on the medical side, we did have involvement in that. And I saw the regime and, was hearing from, in the calls I was having and in the meetings I was having, that veterans were getting prescriptions between 5 and 10 grams a day of cannabis to deal with the trauma associated with their time in Afghanistan. In the Canadian context, we had soldiers serving in Afghanistan, and for 20 years since 9/11. And they were coming back deeply traumatized, deeply wounded, if not physically and mentally. And the solution, and it was a compassionate solution, was to offer them medical cannabis to deal with this. What the size of these prescriptions was indicating, however, was that it wasn't really dealing with the heart of the matter. It was simply a Band-Aid. It was almost symptoms. Like the zombification of these poor souls who were getting up in the morning and smoking till the minute they went to sleep at night. Right. Yeah. And I didn't view that, or I didn't feel like that was an adequate solution. It was better than perhaps the alternatives, but it still wasn't good in an objective sense. And so as I started reading more about psychedelics and the work that Dublin was doing with veterans using MDMA, I became persuaded that there was actually a way to get to the heart of the matter and not just mask or Band-Aid over what people are feeling with SSRIs or cannabis, but really try and break through and get to the source of the pain and the suffering. So it was in that context that I really became persuaded that there was a broader mission in my life to help people overcome these challenges, and not by masking it or Band-Aiding it, but by dealing with it. And of course, COVID only added jet fuel to that. Oh yeah. So that was my journey to this business. And of course, Jay and I quickly realized that while we had high hopes for MDMA and psilocybin as therapeutics in the legal context, the only tool in the tool belt at the moment is ketamine. Yeah. And so that's what led us to the creation of Nushama and the creation of these clinics for the deployment of ketamine to treat mood disorders.
Got it. So there's kind of this practical aspect of, ketamine is the only kind of element or the molecule compound that you can use within the kind of legal scope right now. But I guess, how did you decide, like, as you looked at where you could get involved in the industry, kind of apply your background skill sets, where the need was, like, was there consideration or how did you get down to, okay, this is where we really want to focus our effort and what we want to create in terms of a company?
Right. So we quickly eliminated drug development, right? Okay. Neither one of us has the skill set for that. And we also realized that it was highly binary, meaning either you're going to develop a compound that's accepted or purchased by a larger player, or you're going to get nowhere. And so it's sort of a lotto ticket type of business in our minds, right? It's either going to be phenomenal or more likely go to zero. And so given that binary nature and our skill set, that was sort of quickly eliminated. But the other part of the thought process was, what can we do to help people now? And drug development doesn't help anyone now. So the only thing that we could think of that would help people in the here and now was a place to safely administer in a thoughtful and medically supervised but spiritually informed way ketamine clinics. And we were lucky enough to be introduced through Jay's connections to an anesthesiologist in New York named Dr. Elena Ocher, who became the third partner of Nushama. And she's been working with ketamine for over 30 years, first as a military doctor in the former Soviet Union, and then as a practitioner in New York State for the past 20 years, both as an anesthetic and as an analgesic, but for the last few years, and at lower doses for mood disorders. And so that at that point, when we met Dr. Ocher and realized that we could start working immediately and not in some distant, point in time that may or may not ever come to full fruition because of the regulatory regime, that sort of helped make the decision for us.
And tell me about, like, as you look at ketamine as a compound and what it can do and what it can't do relative to some of these other things, I guess, what's your kind of assessment in terms of kind of its application or its kind of effectiveness or where it can be applied? And how does that compare to some of these other compounds, molecules, as you kind of think through the future? Are you planning to introduce some of these other kind of things that are coming down the pike or potentially getting legalized? Like, how does this work in terms of strategy for solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bruce. Right now, ketamine is, as you mentioned, the only legal tool in our quiver, but Nushama will certainly, as the legal framework expands, starting with MDMA, hopefully by 2023 or 2024, solely for the treatment of PTSD.
Yeah.
But in the context of how ketamine helps certain mood disorders, given that it's the only legal one, it's still, for many of these mood disorders, the best option for many people. And if it's not the best option, it's a close second. So ketamine at the moment can treat or help treat treatment-resistant depression, generalized anxiety disorder, alcoholism, opioid abuse, obsessive-compulsive disorder, really what we refer to at Nushama as ailments of the spirit. We feel that people, and this has certainly been exacerbated by COVID, are de-spirited.
Yeah.
And we're strong proponents of the general concept that it's 10% molecule, it's 10% diagnosis, and 80% integration. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
It means that when you administer a ego-dissolving compound, whether that be ketamine, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, LSD, DMT, or ibogaine, there's an experience. And it's not just a physiological or pharmacological experience.
Yeah.
It's a psychospiritual one.
Yeah.
And people, as their ego dissolves, they experience the absence of ego, the absence of judgment. They're devoid of fear, and they play the witness, and they get to see certain things about themselves, whether that be wounds or traumas that they've experienced as a child, or certain things that might not have made sense on this plane of consciousness, but when your ego dissolves, it certainly makes a whole lot more sense. And so there's an experience here that needs to be integrated. And at Nushama, what we do is we really spend a lot of time with patients or journeyers or participants to get them prepared for what the psychedelic experience is. And make no mistake, high-dose ketamine administered through an IV does indeed create as bona fide of a psychedelic experience as almost any compound out there. Everyone is a little bit different, but it certainly does occasion an ego-dissolving experience. And it's our job at Nushama not only to create a safe environment for these people, but also to help them integrate their experience. What was their key takeaway? What did they learn? What did they see? And how can they learn from that experience and bring that into their lives? And an analogy I always kind of like to use, as I remember I was taking my 8-year-old on a roller coaster, and she was it was her first time. She was so afraid of going on. And as they buckled us in or strapped us in and we were going up the big hill, she said, "Daddy, I want to get off." And unfortunately, I was powerless at that moment. So we both had to collectively, proverbially let go, as they say, or surrender to the experience. And lo and behold, after the ride ended, my 8-year-old said to me, "I want to go again." Yes. and that really is the experience with people's mood disorders, especially when they re-experience a trauma without their ego. They get to see it for what it is. They don't color it with their stories or their life experience. They get to see it for what it is. They look at it. They often feel it in physical manifestations. It could be euphoria, it could be pain. And then they're able to transcend it after they've re-experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah, so talk to me a little bit about, I mean, you kind of mentioned the physical part, like how do you create a safe, conducive physical environment process to support the experience, and then you more of kind of the psychological, the prep work, actually going through the experience itself, integration. What have you kind of learned, or what's been your strategy and your kind of design around those elements to create, the experience or create the effect that you're looking for?
Look, we're learning every single day. This is the new frontier. And despite the fact that psychedelics have been used for 6,000 years in the Amazon and in various other indigenous cultures, above ground in the medical context, we're learning every day. And one of the things we've learned is that there's kind of a strange, nonsensical to non-medical personnel of what we've learned from ketamine, which is lower doses, believe it or not, are more addictive and more dangerous than higher doses. So if you had an experience with us at a very, very low dose, you might not actually get a lot of work done. You might not have the opportunity to go within. What you might do is you might feel euphoric, a high of sorts.
Yep.
And that kind of creates a dependency that you don't want. But worse than that, it doesn't achieve what people came to do, which is to work on themselves, to take a look in the mirror, and to tell themselves the truth. And with higher dose ketamine, what it does do is it takes the euphoria out of it. And what it does do is it really creates an experience where people can actually see unvarnished what the truth is about themselves, allows them to go within. And it's definitely not euphoric. And at these dosages, it really does create a psychedelic experience that, like other psychedelics, is not only not addictive, but it fights addictions, which is super interesting.
Yeah. And tell me, like, what have been some of the challenges around this? Like, as you've kind of really thought about it as a business, or you've put together it as a business, like where have been kind of the hurdles or the things you kind of struggled with or really had to kind of figure out to make this work?
I would say the biggest hurdle is stigma at the moment. To the extent that people have heard of ketamine, they've heard of it in not super positive contexts. So first, they might know it as a horse tranquilizer. And of course, with all the talk of ivermectin as a horse dewormer, and there's lots of like, what are you talking about kind of jokiness. Or they may recall it as a party drug, Special K.
Yep.
They don't really understand its provenance. They don't understand its uses as an anesthetic, as an analgesic, and as at the doses we deliver as an ego dissolving occasioner.
Yep.
So there's this stigma around it amongst, or just a lack of knowledge altogether, right? So you're fighting either a negative context or a non-context. Like, Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And so to the extent that people don't know anything about ketamine, there's an education component as well. And it's not just for the journeyers themselves, but also referrers, psychiatrists,
exactly.
neurologists. They also have their own biases and stigma associated with this. So there's still a ton of work to be done at the medical level and at the broader population level to really destigmatize. And that's where I think that's one of the biggest challenges for sure.
Yeah.
That's thawing every day too. There's articles in every major newspaper and online news organization talking about psilocybin and MDMA and even LSD. And so we're slowly thawing that glacier from the Timothy Leary era. So it's even with ketamine as a psychedelic, a challenge is just educating everybody involved to thaw the entire glacier of psychedelics, not just ketamine.
Yeah. I'm curious on the medical professional side, do you find that, the folks that seem to be embracing or, willing to investigate this are, folks that know more about, ketamine, about these molecules and see kind of how they work and what the potential is? Or are you finding, folks that are dealing with conditions that are just so unresolved, it's kind of why not try something else because nothing else seems to work? Is it a desperation or is it hey, we actually understand these molecules and what they can do for us? I'm curious of where you're seeing kind of the uptake in the medical community.
It's interesting. I think the biggest opportunity for the medical establishment really resolves in their pain points. We speak to psychiatrists and therapists all the time, kind of helping to educate on the safety and the efficacy of ketamine and other psychedelics. And we hear, wow, this is terrific new kind of novel solution because hopefully I can now start to see some new patients. The mental health pandemic has gotten so bad in this country that you've got people who've gotten into the mental health side of medicine unable to see new patients because their existing ones are not getting better.
Yeah.
So I think this has been a huge opportunity for many of them. But it's also, I think, a lot of doctors now are starting to understand the notion, or at least are open to the idea that the body keeps the score, which is a famous book that was written fairly recently, a bestseller, which talks about how one's mood, one's consciousness can affect their physiology. And so now people are looking at things like migraines, fibromyalgia, chronic pain conditions that and even irritable bowel syndrome as psychosomatic illnesses that are without solution. And maybe, just maybe, if you can put one of your struggling patients with IBS or any of these other psychosomatic conditions into an experience where they can learn about their traumas and let go of them, maybe that could help their physiology. And so there's a lot more doctors are open to that, which is, for us, very, very exciting.
Yeah. How is this playing out in kind of the healthcare systems that we have at this point? And I know that kind of the Canadian system, US system are a little different. I know other countries have different kind of approaches to this, but what are you noticing in terms of the dynamics of how to actually bring these solutions to people through healthcare systems? Is it just, this is all private services? Are you seeing a future potential of doing this through the healthcare systems? And what are the dynamics you're seeing in terms of why or why not embrace these from, healthcare kind of policy?
So we've seen some encouraging news at the state level. For instance, a network of clinics in Utah announced that some insurers will now provide coverage for ketamine for mood disorders. Ketamine has traditionally been off-label for depression. It's on-label for pain, but it's off-label for depression. So that was very encouraging that certain insurers in the state of Utah, for instance, will be covering ketamine for mood disorder. This is an important point. The access for the great need that's out there is going to come when there is the ability to use insurance to cover these treatments.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if there is a bona fide pain diagnosis, then insurance becomes part of the mix. If there isn't a bona fide pain diagnosis, then right now in New York where we operate, ketamine is out of pocket. A lot of the other related services can be insured. And one of the things that we're doing, and this is an important part of our ethos around access and making sure we do provide access to those in need and not simply to those who can afford to pay, is working in a group setting. And what groups enable us to do is really two things. One, allow a much more modest entry point from an out-of-pocket point of view. It allows us also to do some pro bono work, because in the context of a group, a couple of members of the group who are there, on a needs basis, we can still provide the services to everyone equally, and it's neither here nor there sort of economically. And groups also enable, in many ways, a more efficacious treatment. I mean, there's a reason why so many things that we see around, addiction, like AA or weight loss and Weight Watchers, are done in groups. And that's so that there is this creation of a support network, people who are in the same boat as you, who are going through the same struggles as you. And, you really can learn from each other. So we believe that an important component of this work going forward, and we've already done some groups and we're going to be doing more and more at our facilities, is to focus on group access. And this will enable us to also, get more bodies through the door, because what the insurance companies really want to see is evidence that this is efficacious and that it will save them money in the long run. And we truly believe that. I mean, this isn't all about dollars and cents, but for insurance companies, it really is around value-based care and making sure that instead of having to pay long-term disability and having people go through a million different treatments, and all these things put a lot of stress on the healthcare system. They put a lot of stress on insurance premiums. And if we can show, and we will, that this is not only works, but is a net saver to the whole system in terms of both time, money, and resources, then we believe that it's only a matter of time that, insurers in all the states are going to recognize the value of this.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the beginning, one of the reasons you sort of chose this path rather than drug development was, just the risk profile, the capital requirements. But I imagine there's still, investment that needs to be made. Like, where have you had to develop, create investment, get investment? Where have you deployed that? Like, what does that look like in terms of building the business?
So we're a clinics-based business, and we have 3 in New York City, 2 in Manhattan, and 1 in Brooklyn. And really, from a capital point of view, the big business expense is the build out of the space to make sure it looks the way you want it to look. And then, there are security deposits and sort of uses of cash like that. And then you also have to have the staff, and you have to have the staff whether 100 people show up or nobody shows up, right? Exactly. So there are certain fixed costs associated with clinics that are there regardless of your throughput. But we were fortunate to start with 2 existing clinics that had a patient base through our partnership with Dr. Ocher. And the third clinic that we built in Midtown Manhattan, we believe is just an amazing location. We're already seeing a pretty significant daily number of patients there. And so there is a pathway to break even and then a pathway to making it, sustainable from an economic point of view. Because while we want to help people, we have to be in business to help people, right? And so we need a model that is sustainable. And we believe we have one. We have growth plans to open more clinics. We believe that over time, people aren't going to travel great distances for this. They're going to want it local to them. But, our focus is to really make sure that the 3 clinics we have in New York City are functioning properly and that we have our model down, more incredibly dialed in, and then start opening more from there.
And what are any particular kind of goals, objectives in terms of where you hope to be in the next couple of years in terms of numbers of clinics or number of patients? What is success for you as you go forward?
We've modeled out the next 5 years as having around 35 clinics, predominantly in the Northeast, although we sometimes like to consider South Florida the Northeast for strategic and lifestyle reasons.
Yes.
But culturally, it is the Northeast. Of course, geographically, it is not. But 35 clinics, in the next 5 years, focused regionally. We believe that in order to get some leverage and regulatory simplicity, focusing on a region makes a lot of sense versus sort of spreading everything all over the place. And, we believe that our model is based on a 10-room clinic, and we expect to see 1,000 unique patients a year per clinic. So at 35 clinics, we would hope to see 35,000 patients a year. That is what success would look like. And that's an amazing number of people in terms of helping, 35,000 people overcome their challenges. What is unbelievably daunting is the evidence from the Kaiser Family Foundation that of the 26 million adults in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, a full third of them are suffering from mood disorders. And so that's 8 million people, 8 million adults. And of those 8 million adults, 75% of them, so 6 million of the 8 million, have received some treatment and 2 million have received no treatment whatsoever. So in our world of what success looks like to us, 35,000 patients is remarkable. In the context of 8 million adults with mood disorders, you can see how great the need is overall for the deployment of these treatments.
Yeah. And